Well, it's nice to be here. So I'll introduce myself, and perhaps, how many people, I don't really get a sense of the audience. How many of you are entrepreneurs? Oh, not many. How many of you are investors? So what are you all, how many of you are students? How many of you don't know what you're doing? How many of you are clueless? That's me. So I thought I would give an introduction to myself, tell you a little bit about my first book, Cult of the Amateur, and then talk about digital Vertigo. So my background is as an entrepreneur. I founded a company called Audio Cafe in the mid-90s. And I always liked the idea of the internet because for me it was a place that, and again this is not very original, it was a place that enabled the distribution of high-quality content. I was very excited. Before I did Audio Cafe, I was a journalist, a music journalist, and I thought it was a great way to actually distribute content. Like many other content people in the 90s, we jumped into the internet. We made, though, a big error. I made the error at Audio Cafe. It was a startup that was backed by Intel and SAP. It wasn't a very interesting one, really, in retrospect, no different from many of the others in the 90s. But we all made a big mistake. We made the error of thinking that the internet business model could be like television, that we'd give the content away for free, and then we could do our revenue, we could build our business model through advertising. Now, at the time in the 90s, that seemed to make sense. When the internet started, when people started going online in the mid-90s, it didn't seem as though we didn't have the nerve, the chutzpah, to actually demand that people pay for their content. So whether it was Audio Cafe or the New York Times or the Guardian or many of the other startups in the 90s, online startups that is, we all thought that the business model would work, that we would give the content away for free, and then we would build business through advertising. Now that was a fatal error. And in 2007, I wrote a book called Cult of the Amateur, which argued that. I suggested that we have become infatuated with free content, that the disintermediation of traditional journalists, the undermining of the traditional authority of journalists, of authors, of many other professionals was a bad thing, and that the internet was being corrupted by what I called the cult of the amateur. I argued that in cultural terms that was a bad thing. In cultural terms it was creating a lot of garbage, and I think it's hard to argue about that. All you've got to do is go onto Facebook or YouTube to see that garbage. But secondly, and perhaps more relevantly, in terms of this audience, because I'm guessing that many of you are entrepreneurs and you want to figure out new business models, or you want to figure out viable business models, I argued in Cult of the Amateur that you couldn't make money from advertising, that the advertising model didn't work. And I was proved to be right, because as Web 2.0 ravaged traditional media, as more and more newspapers shut down, as book publishers are going into crisis, as the music industry was cut in half, partly because of piracy and partly because of the nature of the digital economy, it became harder and harder to sell content online. The free economy, I argued in Cult of the Amateur, and I continue to argue, is a bad thing. So for those, I mean, it's a bad thing in cultural terms because it generates garbage, but it's also a bad thing in business terms because it doesn't enable you to build viable businesses. In 2007, I wrote this book, Cult of the Amateur. It was very controversial. A lot of people deeply objected to the book, which I was thrilled by. I love to upset people. And there was a big argument about whether or not paywalls were essential, whether or not the free content economy was viable. Today, 6, 7 years after the book came out, and it came out with books like The Long Tail, which said the reverse, I think I've been proved to be right. The only viable business models for high-quality content are when people charge for that content. We're seeing it, for example, with the New York Times, who are building a viable business around paywalls. We may be seeing it even with YouTube, which I'd trashed back in 2007 because it was a video network for crappy amateur content, but it's actually become bigger, wider, more substantial today. Even YouTube now is considering opening paid-for channels. My argument then, I think, was right then. The fetish in Silicon Valley with giving out one's content for free doesn't work. Now, it may work in a sense with networks like Twitter, which are essentially amateur content, or Facebook. But it doesn't work for real journalism. It doesn't work for the real information economy. So my first piece of advice for anyone who's in career or elsewhere who wants to go into the content business, don't give your stuff away for free. Charge for it. Have a nerve. Go against traditional thinking. Go against the traditional climate of opinion. Because if you don't, and this is true very often throughout the digital economy, most entrepreneurs are like sheep. And venture capitalists aren't like sheep, they are sheep. No one is thinking for themselves. So you get this idea of let's give our content away for free. Let's start a social network. Everyone does it, and then the economy crashes. And that's what's happened with the content industry. Even today, there are very few examples of viable content businesses. Perhaps Huffington Post is one, although that's essentially a marketing platform. TechCrunch, of course, is another. I have a show on TechCrunch. But they've become traditional. Their money is made through events rather than their online businesses. So my book in 2007, Cult of the Amateur, I think, was important in the sense that it opened up a debate about how to build viable media businesses on the network. It's a debate that still's going on, and it's a debate that I think, for the most part, has been answered. Put up paywalls. Charge for your content. If you've got anything of any value, video, books, music in particular, you have to charge for it. Now, are there any artists out here, any creative people, writers, filmmakers, musicians? I argued in my book, Cult of the Amateur, that the internet, which was acclaimed by many people as this liberating, democratizing force, was actually a bad thing for creative professionals because it undermined our livelihood. It meant that people stole our stuff. It meant that most of the business models lent themselves to giving our stuff away for free. And it's still true. The music industry has been cut in half. The book industry, which I know very well as a writer, is cutting its advances. So if you are a creative artist, the internet is not really a great thing. It's not necessarily a disaster, but you have to be entrepreneurial. You can't rely on current business models. You can't rely on networks like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or any of these other essentially marketing platforms to enable you to make money. And there still are great entrepreneurial opportunities for free-thinking individuals able to crack this dilemma, able to crack the dilemma of how to monetize quality, how to monetize talent, because the internet still hasn't, for the most part, figured that out. How does it enable professional creative people to make a living, pay their rent, clothe themselves, feed themselves? Almost all the successful internet startups in the content side haven't even addressed this issue. So that's one area I would suggest if you are an entrepreneur, if you are ambitious, if you want to rock the boat, if you want to reinvent an industry, that's one area I would suggest you look at critically. The answers aren't obvious. If they were, everyone would be doing it. But those are always the most interesting challenges. Now, my last book, Digital Vertigo, My first book, Cult of the Amateur, came out in Korean, in the Korean language, I think in about 2009. Digital Vertigo came out in most of the world last year. It will come out in a Korean version, but the translation isn't finished yet. But for those of you who want to read it, you can find it on Amazon, so obviously in digital form too. My last book, Digital Vertigo, focused on another serious problem. My goal, my business model, if you like, is to really be counterintuitive. To think about what everyone is agreeing on and then saying, actually, that's crap, that's garbage, or as the English would say, that's bollocks, and rethink it. So back in 2007, everyone was idealizing free content, blogging platforms. Everyone idealized this supposed economy of the amateur, the long tail economy, which was garbage. 5 years later, that was Web 2.0. 5 years later, we have something called Web 3.0. This was a term, again, not a very original term. Web 2.0 was invented by Tim O'Reilly. Web 3.0 is, I'm not sure this clock, Web 3.0 was invented by Reid Hoffman, one of the great geniuses, commercial, intellectual genius of Silicon Valley, the founder, of course, of LinkedIn, the guy who introduced Peter Thiel to Mark Zuckerberg, and is the guy actually behind many of the biggest deals in Silicon Valley. He was a part of the original PayPal mafia. Reid Hoffman came up with the term Web 3.0, which, again, wasn't particularly original since it naturally comes after Web 2.0, but he defined it as an age of ubiquitous personal data. What Hoffman was really doing was introducing this idea of big data. The great shift then in Silicon Valley between, say, 2007 and 2012 or today is a shift between the Web 2.0 model, Web 2.0 economy, to the big data economy. Now, big data, of course, is a term. There's a great new book out, actually, by a couple of guys I've had on my TechCrunch show. It's well worth reading. If you get the chance to. It's called Big Data. But the big data economy, of course, whereas in the Web 2.0 age, the central company was Google, the central company of this Web 3.0 age is Facebook. And the idea of personal data is rooted in the notion of networks like Facebook, of course, and many of the other social networks, whether it's driving networks like WAS, whether it's business networks like LinkedIn, whether it's Google+, whether it's many of these other social services, social products, social television, social reading, social eating, social traveling. Over the past 5 years, going from Web 2.0 to Web 3.0, Silicon Valley has become infatuated, obsessed with the idea of the social, with the idea of us sharing all our data. All these Web 3.0 companies are, again, premised on the free economy, premised on us giving us their data. Sorry, that was an error, giving them our data. They're not giving us anything except a free platform. Us giving them our data. They knowing more and more about us, and then serving up business models, advertising models, which essentially mean that the more they know us, the better advertising rates they can give, the more customized our advertising. Collectively, this mania with the social that I warned about in Digital Vertigo lent itself to a new architecture of the web, an architecture of surveillance and voyeurism. We were simultaneously watching each other and being watched. That's why I call my book Digital Vertigo. Some of you may have seen the great movie by Alfred Hitchcock, Vertigo, 1958 movie. Just voted the greatest movie ever made. A film about a private detective who follows a woman. It's a movie about watching. It's a movie about being watched. It's also a movie about illusion, a movie about delusion, a movie about falling in love with something that doesn't really exist. In Vertigo, the thing that didn't really exist was a beautiful blonde woman who was the star of the movie, Kim Novak. She turned out to be a murderess. Not only a murderess, but someone who dyed their hair. They weren't really a blonde, they were brunette. Can you imagine how disappointing that is, falling in love with a blonde and finding out that they're a brunette? Are there any blondes here? There's no such thing as a natural Korean blonde, is there? If there is, see me afterwards. Hitchcock warned us about falling in love with something that doesn't really exist, something too good to be true. The blonde Korean girl, perhaps. Same happened, of course, in Silicon Valley. We were told that the social was wonderful. We were told that it would enable us to meet all sorts of people. We were told that collaboration and conversation was a good thing. We were told, of course, that this would benefit us, that this Web 3.0 age, this age of big data, would make life more convenient. There were even products, one called Highlight, social location networks, which followed us everywhere we go. Our cell phones, of course, helped, because they were watching us. And as it turned out, and I feel good about writing Digital Vertigo, although perhaps it would have been better for me if it had come out this month rather than last year, we really are being watched. Privacy, as I warned in Digital Vertigo, has become an artifact of history. We've all fallen in love with that blonde. We've all wandered into a world on social media through Web 3.0 in this architecture of voyeurism and surveillance where we're losing our privacy, where we get these free services, whether it's Facebook, which is by definition slimy, of course, or so many of these other social products that know what we're listening to, what we're reading, what we're traveling, what we're riding, what we're wearing, what sometimes, of course, what we're not wearing, what we're thinking, what we had thought, what we will think. And it was collecting, and they are collecting all that data. Now, the recent NSA scandal, of course, is a piece of this. The NSA is not a startup, it's not a social startup. But it's clear that the NSA scandal in the US has tapped into social media. It's tapped into this obsession we have with self-revelation on the network, with giving away our data, giving away our preferences, our fashions, our thoughts, our movements. Foursquare, WAZ, LinkedIn, Twitter. The list is endless. And I argued two things in Digital Vertigo, both of which I believe are correct, even more correct now than when I wrote the book. The first thing I argued is that we are collectively signing away our privacy. We're increasingly living in public, and that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing because we don't want to really give up our privacy, because that's really who we are as human beings. Once we lose our inner world, once we lose the process, that dark space that nobody else can see, we lose who we are as human beings. That's bad in existential terms, it's bad philosophically, it's bad culturally, and it's also bad in business terms. One of the great illusions in Silicon Valley is that the more you collaborate, the more you share, the more innovative you are. There's nothing more incorrect than that. Last year, I made my Digital Vertigo speech in Brussels at a TEDx conference. And one of the guys speaking before me was a fellow most of you will have heard of. His name is Steve Wozniak. He was, of course, the guy who invented the personal computer. But he didn't invent it by collaborating. He didn't invent it by coming to events like this and having group sessions after. He didn't invent it by going on social networks and revealing all his intimate thoughts. He invented the personal computer by working nights and locking himself away and thinking for himself. Real innovation, then, happens alone. It's not a collaborative effort. The real geniuses, the people who change history, the people who really invent important things are not doing it in collaborative terms. Meetings are, for the most part, a waste of time. Many of you work for large corporations. You know that better than I do. One of the nice things about my life, I don't have any economic security. I'm an entrepreneur, but I never have to do meetings. I never have to collaborate. I never have to do group calls. After I gave that speech in Brussels, Wozniak came after me and he said he's cried in the speech, not because of my speech, because he knew it was true, because he knew in this environment of collaboration, this environment of radical transparency, when no one is ever left alone. There are even now these networks like Yammer, corporate social networks, where people have to be on and share stuff. He knew that he wouldn't have been able to do what he did. So that was the first thing I was right about. Collaboration is against innovation. It's a bad thing. It doesn't benefit companies. So if you work for a large company, and I know there are some very successful and well-run large companies in Korea, don't get seduced by that blonde of collaboration. Don't get seduced into thinking that you should put Yammer in the workplace. Make sure that the people who work for you have time alone. Make sure that they have a dark place, a place that they can escape to, a place where they don't have to be conventional, a place where they can truly think for themselves. Because that's one of the problems with Web 3.0. That's one of the problems with this network that's increasingly dominating our life, that's becoming essentially the platform for 21st century cultural, economic, and political life. It's life itself. The virtual and the real no longer can be distinguished. The second thing I said, and I think this is perhaps particularly relevant today, is that there's going to be a backlash. We always, and I'm not the only person to argue this in a lot of privacy advocates, we all said the same thing. We all said that, like in the environmental movement, there's going to be an Exxon Valdez moment. A terrible spillage of personal data, just as the Exxon Valdez tanker disaster lit up the environmental movement, so a similar kind of data catastrophe would prove to be the foundation, the logistical grounds for a new movement in defense of privacy. And this is what this NSA thing is going to do. It just broke. You've all, I'm sure, been following it, even though it's not taking place in Korea. But what has been revealed is that the government, with the help of tech companies, have been spying on all of us, watching all of us. And I think what we're going to see, and we've already seen a little bit of this in the last year or two, we're going to see a radical reaction in cultural and business terms to Web 3.0, to the age of big data. We're going to see more and more companies focusing on privacy. Examples are DuckDuckGo, for example, in New York, a new search engine which is the anti-Google, which guarantees that we'll never be tracked, that guarantees that it doesn't acquire our data. And as you have more and more of these big data companies and their devices shaping life, whether it's Google Glass, in which Google becomes our eyes, and everything we see somehow ends up in the Google data vaults, whether it's these medical device companies that are able to monitor our heart rates, how much we exercise, whether it's an Apple wristwatch that will know, again, everywhere we go, whether it's Google's self-driving cars, which will sit in and which they will acquire all the data of everywhere we go. There's going to be a dramatic reaction of ordinary people, people swept into this kind of Hitchcockian noir of a world where nobody trusts anyone else, where everyone's looking over their shoulder, a world of voyeurism and surveillance. And that's where I think the next wave of entrepreneurial opportunity exists. Don't think social. You've missed the social bus by about 5 years or 3 years. Social, in my view, is dead, in the same way as Web 2.0 is dead. Today, the real innovation, the real excitement will come with companies confronting this new reality, confronting the idea that, yes, we live in an age of big data. We can't go back. We're not going to go back to some analog cave. We're not going to go back to a pre-computer age. Technology, Moore's law, is inevitably changing everything, for the most part, for the better. But we have to adapt to it. If we leave everything to the market or everything to market-driven companies like Facebook, then we're going to regret it. So we do need probably government to protect data, government to protect privacy. You're already seeing that in the EU. I would hope you would see it in Korea as well. But we're also going to see great opportunities for entrepreneurs, for people with good ideas about products, networks, services, devices that will be helpful to us, but will not result in our data going somewhere else, our data being exploited, our data ending up in the hands of marketers, foreign governments, intelligence services, other organizations that we have no idea of what we're doing. So that's the good news. Is there any bad news? I don't know. I've got 4 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? They said that you're a quiet audience. You're not as quiet as in Finland, but prove to me you're alive out there. Someone asked me a question. You don't want me going back to California and saying, Korea is dead. Question. Brave man or woman, I can't really see. Shout the question.
What do you think about every country hacking other countries and downloading all the secret information and force instant transfer of wealth in 1 minute? And if that continues like that, what do you think is the likelihood of longevity of the internet?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I don't think I can answer that in 3 minutes, but I think that the issue of governments hacking and cyber warfare are, again, increasingly going to become dominant. People are more and more fearful about it, and we're seeing the emergence of other networks like Anonymous and WikiLeaks that are also kind of international, almost like data terrorism organizations. I think it's deeply worrying, and I think the real confrontation is between China and the US. It's no coincidence, I think, that Edward Snowden, the guy who, depends how you think of him, and I'm somewhat ambivalent about him. I respect him in some ways, and in some ways I'm very suspicious. But it's no coincidence that having revealed this spectacular amount of intelligence, perhaps the most significant and dramatic official leakage of data by the American government since the Pentagon Papers 50 or 40 years ago, where would he run to? He didn't run to Iceland, didn't run to Albania or Russia, he went to Hong Kong, which is essentially China. So in calling the US and the CIA and the NSA's bluff, I think that that reality is very scary. I think there are also many, many entrepreneurial opportunities in that area. I'm not sure if it's an area I'd want my kids to be involved in. It's a murky, dangerous area, and I think cyber warfare will increasingly become the dominant mode of warfare in the 21st century. Syria is archaic, people actually fighting one another with guns. The real future, I think, is cyber warfare. So it's a great question. And I think it deserves a longer answer, but there's no doubt it's of immense significance. One more quick question, anyone? Web 4.0, well, that's a great one. Well, I think, as I said, I think Web 4.0 is privacy. Web 4.0 is figuring out, as the web, the network becomes indistinguishable from real life. There's a great moment in the movie The Social Network when the fictional Sean Parker said he was trying to, the Sean Parker, the original president of Facebook, he was acted by Justin Timberlake. Some of you may have seen the film. He's getting very excited as a party, and he's always selling Parker. That's why he's such a successful guy. And he's saying, first we lived in villages, then we lived in cities, and now we live on the internet. And I think that's true. We don't live in the internet. You can't crawl into a computer. But we live on the internet. The network is the reality of 21st century life. So I think Web 4.0 and the waves of innovation and challenges and controversies that will come now, from now until, say, next year is the 25th anniversary of Tim Berners-Lee's invention of the World Wide Web. Between next year and another 25 years, what we're going to see are more and more challenges, problems with living on the network. The other thing, which I think is immense, is we're going to go from a network of about 2.5 billion today, a mobile network, of course, to one of about 7 or 8 billion in about 10 years' time. So Web 4.0 or 5.0, we've always talked about the internet as a global force, but it's never really been global. It's always been essentially American, maybe a little bit Korean and Chinese and Western European. But in the next 10 or 15 years, it's going to be truly global. And the cultural ramifications, the cultural consequences, the upheavals in more traditional societies from the network are going to be much more dramatic than everything we've seen today. So I think Web 4.0 and everything after it will actually be more dramatic, more consequential, and more interesting for all of us, which is a good thing for me because it'll enable me to write more books. Thank you very much.